In early 1933, the Nazi Party seized power in Germany. 2 months later, following a short campaign featuring violence by the Nazis and voter intimidation, 87% of the electorate actually turned out to vote. Hitler supporters and Nazi stormtroopers, violent paramilitary equipped with fists, guns, and knives, turned out in force to guarantee that they won this election. All the Nazis needed was to get into power. After that, they made sure there would never be another free election. This was the last free election in Germany until after World War II. The Nazis got a 44% plurality, not a majority, but that was quite good enough for Hitler to use it to ban all other parties except his own, and to turn the Reichstag into a rubber-stamp legislature. The party needed political power so that it could seize the levers of government, and once grabbed, never planned to give it up. This was a prerequisite for what came next. Nazi ideology was based on racism. Specifically, anyone who wasn't one of them, a white, Christian, and so-called pure-blooded Aryan, was subhuman and a waste of resources to be eliminated. Their plan was to exterminate everyone who didn't make the cut, not just inside of Germany, but inside of all of their newly annexed lands. There isn't a really good estimate of how many people died because of this ideology, but we do know that men, women, the handicapped, aged, sick, prisoners of war, forced laborers, camp inmates, critics, homosexuals, Jews, Slavs, Serbs, Germans, Czechs, Italians, Poles, some French, Ukrainians, and many others died. This image shows picketers in front of a Jewish business place during the Nazi boycott on April 1, 1933. The Nazi Party promised as part of its election campaign that when it came to power, only racially pure residents of the Reich would be allowed to hold citizenship. This meant that Jews, defined as a separate race for this purpose, couldn't be full citizens. They had no political rights and no economic rights. This led to the forced expropriation of Jewish property and eventually to the Jews being rounded up and deported to concentration and death camps. The Nazi government soon clarified and expanded the Nuremberg laws so that they applied to all non-Aryans, as they defined the term. After the war, the people of Germany decided they could never let this happen again, although there was considerable opposition to taking any overt steps to educate the public. Even so, education in the form of schools and memorials is designed to this day to make sure people remember exactly who the Nazis were, what they stood for, and the consequences of a supine public that stood by or actively supported them. The name here means the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. This is a muted but open admission that the persecution spread and was taken up by authorities far outside of Germany. Hitler reportedly told Himmler that it wasn't enough for the Jews simply to die. They had to die in agony. Merely murdering the Jews was insufficient to quell his racist rage. Himmler and his doctors devised several methods, which I won't go into here, designed to cause an agonizing and, if possible, slow death. The Berlin government and the German government dedicated 5 acres of extremely valuable ground here in the center of the town for this memorial, a short distance from the Reichstag building. Some German politicians tried to stand up to the Nazi regime back in 1933. They were mostly Social Democrats and communists, obviously not Nazis, and they were the last of those who could have stopped them, at least through the legislature. They failed. Between 1933 and 1945, 96 of them that we know about died unnatural deaths. Hitler had them all murdered. Each of the slabs you see here was engraved with the name, date of birth, date of death, and whether or not they died in a concentration camp. The memorial went up in 1996. You can see there's empty space on either side of those slabs. It's designed so that new slabs can be added if and when more names are discovered. Even the Nazis were incapable of murdering all of the people they deemed unfit, along with all of their imaginary enemies of the state, at one time. It took time to build out the system of concentration, slave labor, and extermination camps. Action T4 was a campaign of mass murder by involuntary euthanasia, directed specifically against patients in psychiatric hospitals and asylums. The killings took place from September 1939 until the end of the war. An estimated 300,000 people were killed in psychiatric hospitals and asylums in Germany and Austria, occupied Poland, and what is now the Czech Republic. About half of those murdered were taken from church-run facilities and asylums. often with the approval of local Catholic and Protestant authorities. The reasons given for the program included, first of all, the Nazi plans to protect the master race by weeding out the physically and mentally infirm. Aside from eliminating inferior bloodlines, the Nazis had a practical reason for doing all of this. They had looked at food and energy supply charts at the beginning of the war and concluded that shortages of each were a probability, especially if, for example, their plans to rapidly conquer Ukraine, to this day a major grain producer, were delayed. Fewer and disabled people meant not just fewer inferiors being kept alive who would not contribute to the war effort, it meant fewer mouths to feed. This rather unattractive chunk of concrete commemorates the persecution of homosexuals in Germany. Homosexual activity was illegal but generally tolerated in Germany. Many male homosexuals served in the military during World War I. They were good enough to fight and die for the Kaiser, but apparently not good enough to be allowed to live by the Nazis. The Nazis were elected by the Germans in 1933. Part of the appeal was that they would put so-called undesirables in their place. After the Nazi takeover of the country, the infrastructure supporting gay clubs, organizations, and publications was shut down. In 1934, persecuting homosexuals, not just their acts but their very existence, became a prime Nazi objective. The law governing this was rewritten in a way to make it much easier to arrest gays. Persecution spread all over Germany, into Austria, what we think of as Czechia and Slovakia, and into the Alsace-Lorraine. It was also quite common in the Soviet Union, which at the time was allied with the Germans. Between 1933 and 1945, an estimated 100,000 men were arrested for homosexuality. About half of them died. Homosexual concentration camp prisoners weren't even considered victims of National Socialism until the 2000s. Laws against consensual homosexual behavior was finally repealed in Germany in 1994. The Romani genocide was a Nazi effort with its World War II allies and collaborators to commit ethnic cleansing of the European Roma and Sinti people. The Nuremberg laws did more than just disenfranchise some citizens and declare them unfit to reproduce, or even to live. Under that 1935 law, some groups were declared enemies of the race-based state, giving the government free rein to eliminate them as undesirables. This monument is dedicated to the memory of the 220,000 to 500,000, nobody really knows how many, Romani and Sinti people murdered in Germany and in Nazi-occupied countries, where the plan was taken up with considerable enthusiasm. This monument sits in the middle of a block that was formerly the site of a synagogue and Jewish community center that the Nazi government closed. By 1943, most Germans either supported the murderous actions of the state or were too frightened to protest. In February 1943, Germany suffered a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad. The Nazis considered all Slavic people to be subhuman and was going to have a hard time explaining this loss. There were so many German dead and so much lost material that no amount of propaganda could hide it. Joseph Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister and in total control of all press and communications inside of Germany, and Hitler needed some fall guys. The remaining Jewish population, along with many others in Berlin, were selected for the role. Despite the Nuremberg laws, which dated back to the foundation of the regime, these men had managed to survive mostly unmolested. They were in a privileged category, exempt from deportation and the other measures by the fact that they were married to German spouses, defined at that point as Aryan Christian, and also some employment as government officials. Goebbels and Hitler decided to end that privilege. He had 10,000 Berliners, including about 1,800 Jewish men, arrested, detained, and scheduled for deportation. The Jewish men were separated out from the rest, most likely because they were scheduled for special and different treatment, which was never a good thing, and detained near here. Goebbels ordered a total media blackout, but it was impossible for him to hide the fact that literally overnight, 10,000 Berliners had vanished. Word got out, specifically of the detained Jewish men. A group of non-Jewish wives and relatives of the men gathered near here and demanded to speak with their relatives. They were refused. They came back and staged a demonstration. The Reich Security Office was in favor of shooting the women, and on the first and second nights, some of them actually showed up, armed and in vehicles, but apparently they were too afraid to murder them. When faced with opposition, they backed off, and some stories say they call on the Berlin City Police Department to come and do the dirty work, but the police department apparently declined. After 7 nights, Goebbels finally gave up on the idea of mowing them down where they stood because he understood no amount of Nazi propaganda could hide the fact that the regime had massacred unarmed women in the middle of the city. News would get out and undermine German morale by suggesting that at least some Germans weren't all in on the total war effort. Goebbels decided to cut his losses. On March 6, he ordered the release of all the Jewish men imprisoned in the community center. These women did something at great personal risk and peril. This was the only mass demonstration by Germans against the deportation of the Jews. I've never been able to learn how many of the women or their husbands managed to survive the Historians will argue until the end of time about the primary source, but the proven truth of this expression will always apply. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. We also know one more thing. Those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. The modern German government is determined to make sure that the hatred and the war crimes that it perpetrated upon the population of Western Europe is never repeated. Thank you for joining me today on a visit to these very important and significant World War II anti-Nazi monuments in Berlin. Please come back next week as we continue our tour of modern, rebuilt, and thoroughly enlightened Berlin here on The Armchair Traveler.